the world was holding its breath. In a cold courtroom in Nuremberg, the echo of boots no longer meant war. It meant justice. The same city that once heard the speeches of madness now awaited the verdict of reason. The marble walls, cracked by bombings, seemed to listen in silence as history itself was about to speak. It was December 1946. Outside, the winter was merciless. The wind carried the ashes of a world that had burned too long. Inside, 11 men sat motionless behind the wooden dock. Doctors, scientists, men who once held scalpels, now stripped of their white coats. They had sworn to heal, but used their knowledge to torture, infect, mutilate, and kill. Their names were not yet ghosts. They were flesh, eyes, and fear. The lights flickered. A translator whispered into a microphone. One of the accused, thin and pale, stared at the floor as if he could still see the faces of those he had condemned to die. Another kept his hands tightly clasped, muttering silent prayers that even heaven might have refused to hear. Across from them, the judges waited. The world had sent them to answer one question that no one had dared to ask before. Can a doctor commit a crime against humanity? The testimonies had been unbearable. Frozen experiments, injections, open wounds, and living subjects treated as numbers. Yet the witnesses came, trembling, to describe what the eyes of medicine had done when guided by evil. Every sound in the room carried weight. The ticking of a clock felt like the heartbeat of a dying era. Even the pens scratching on paper seemed to carve the truth into eternity. Soon, sentences would be spoken, not by generals, but by the conscience of mankind. The same hands that once wrote prescriptions for death would now be judged by life itself. The silence grew heavier, and in that silence, the question that no verdict could erase still lingered. When the healer becomes the executioner, who will heal the world? They had called themselves healers of the Reich. But the hospitals of their regime were not built for the sick. They were laboratories of pain. Behind their clean walls, beneath the red banners and the portraits of power, science had been twisted into a weapon sharper than any blade. The experiments began in whispers. They started with studies for the good of the nation, reports stamped with official seals, written in careful, educated words. Yet behind those words lay the screams of men and women frozen alive, burned with chemicals, suffocated in chambers built to test endurance. The doctors sought not to cure, but to perfect death. In Dachau, the air froze around the truth. Prisoners were plunged into icy tanks, while the physicians observed their bodies shiver, stop, and sink. The purpose was simple: to find the limits of human survival for German pilots. They measured time, pain, breath, and heartbeat, recording the moment life surrendered. Some were revived, others left to die as data. At Ravensbrück, women became subjects of surgical innovation. Their legs were cut open to simulate wounds, infected deliberately, filled with dirt and splinters. No anesthesia, no dignity. Only notebooks full of numbers and the quiet clicking of shoes on the tiled floor as the doctors passed by, indifferent. In Buchenwald, prisoners were injected with typhus, malaria, and poisons. Children watched their fathers collapse. Some doctors argued these were scientific necessities. Others said nothing, afraid or convinced that silence was patriotism. And yet, in those same corridors, there were men who hesitated, hands trembling, voices breaking. They signed orders and looked away, thinking obedience would cleanse them. But obedience became complicity, and complicity became evil, disguised as duty. The empire they served had promised purity, progress, and destiny. It gave them laboratories, ranks, medals, and the illusion of purpose. They believed they were building a stronger race, Instead, they destroyed what was most human within themselves. As the war neared its end, the files grew thicker. Photographs, reports, signatures, all meticulously archived, as if the horror could be justified by paperwork. When the Reich collapsed, some doctors burned their notes, others tried to flee. But the ashes told their stories. The victims' bones were still in the ground, marked by the precision of a surgeon's hand. The Allied investigators who entered those hospitals could not believe what they saw. Scalpel trays beside torture devices, medical charts beside corpses. The cold perfection of men who had forgotten that a beating heart was not a specimen, but a miracle. One of the investigators later wrote, "It was not madness. It was method." That sentence became the heart of the accusation. These were not monsters born from chaos. They were educated, disciplined, rational, and they chose to serve evil. The trial would not only reveal what they did, but how civilization itself can rot when science loses its soul. Now, the evidence lay before the court, photographs on the table, witnesses waiting outside, 11 men in their seats, staring at the documents that bore their signatures. The judges turned the pages slowly, as if each photograph carried the weight of an entire civilization's fall. And then came the words that no courtroom had ever dared to pronounce before: crimes against humanity. The courtroom in Nuremberg had become a theater of silence. The war was over, but its echoes trembled through every word spoken there. Behind the defendants sat rows of soldiers, translators, and witnesses. Each carried a different kind of burden, one of memory, one of guilt, and one of judgment. When the first witness entered, the room seemed to shrink. She was a woman from Ravensbrück. Her body, thin as paper, carried scars that even time could not erase. The judges rose slightly as she approached the stand. She did not look at the accused. She looked at the floor, as if afraid that their eyes still had power. Her voice was soft, trembling, but steady. She spoke of nights filled with screams, of surgical tables where life was traded for data. She remembered the smell of blood and disinfectant, the doctor who smiled before cutting, the coldness of hands that were trained to heal. And when she finished, there was no sound, not even from the translators. One of the accused lowered his head, another clenched his jaw. A third kept his eyes closed, whispering something no one could hear. The judges asked questions, one after another, trying to understand the purpose of these experiments. Were these operations authorized? By whom? Under what justification? The answers came in fragments, bureaucratic, rehearsed, desperate. For the good of the army, for research, for the nation. But no one in that room believed those words anymore. The prosecutor, a young American officer, stood and placed photographs on the table. Bones, wounds, lifeless faces. "Gentlemen," he said, "these are not the results of science. They are the remains of conscience." The translators hesitated. The phrase was too heavy, too poetic, but the meaning reached every ear. During the weeks that followed, more witnesses came. A nurse who falsified reports to hide the dead. A soldier who delivered prisoners to the labs. A doctor's assistant who confessed that he had injected poison into veins because refusal meant his own death. Every testimony peeled away another layer of justification, revealing what the courtroom already knew: that evil often hides behind uniforms and titles. One afternoon, as snow fell outside, the lead defendant finally spoke. He rose slowly, holding the edge of the bench, and looked directly at the judges. "I did what was required of me," he said. "I was a soldier of science. My orders came from above. If I am guilty, then so is the world that allowed it." The room went cold. Even the lights seemed to dim. For a brief moment, no one moved. It was not arrogance that filled his voice. It was emptiness. He truly believed obedience could wash away murder. The chief judge leaned forward, his voice calm but sharp. Obedience does not erase choice. You were not a machine. You were a man. The defendant said nothing. He sat down, hands trembling, eyes fixed on the floor. Outside the courtroom, crowds waited. Survivors, journalists, soldiers. The world wanted to see justice, to feel that order had returned. But inside, the judges felt something heavier, the weight of defining humanity itself. This trial was not just about 11 men. It was about what men are capable of becoming when conscience surrenders to power. Days turned into weeks. The translators' voices grew hoarse. The documents piled higher. And yet, the same question remained unanswered. Could a civilized world ever claim innocence after this? Finally, the chief prosecutor closed the case with a single sentence. He stood in silence for a long time before speaking, his words echoing like a prayer. These men thought they were serving their nation, but they forgot they were serving mankind. And in that stillness, as the judges prepared their verdicts, everyone in the courtroom understood. History was not judging only the guilty. It was judging the silence of those who had watched and done nothing. The final day came with a gray dawn. A thin mist hung over Nuremberg, softening the ruins outside the Palace of Justice. Inside, the courtroom filled with the heavy air of inevitability. The judges entered quietly. No one spoke. Even the translators, who had repeated thousands of words, now seemed afraid of sound. The defendants stood. 11 men in faded suits, their faces pale, their bodies smaller than before. Their arrogance had evaporated long ago. What remained were hollow shells of intellect and fear. Some still believed in justification, others in nothing at all. The presiding judge unfolded a sheet of paper. The first words cut through the silence like a blade. In the name of humanity. For months, the court had heard numbers, documents, reports. Now came sentences. Not of statistics, but of finality. One by one, their names were spoken. One by one, their fates were sealed. The courtroom was not a battlefield, yet every word struck like gunfire. Condemned to death by hanging. The translators repeated it in German, English, Russian, French. The sound echoed across languages, across histories. The meaning remained the same. The reckoning had come. A few of the condemned stared straight ahead. One whispered a prayer. Another asked for forgiveness, not from men, but from the God he had ignored when he chose science over mercy. One wept silently, shaking like a child, and one, the youngest, simply smiled. A cold, broken smile that vanished as quickly as it appeared. When the judge's voice finally stopped, the room remained frozen. No applause, no sighs of relief. Justice had spoken, but no one felt triumph. There was no victory in the act of hanging doctors. There was only the weight of recognition that these men, once trusted with life, had chosen to serve death. The executions were carried out weeks later in the stillness of dawn. The sky above the prison was the color of iron. Guards moved like shadows. A chaplain whispered last rites. The condemned walked the corridor slowly, each step echoing like a heartbeat fading away. One of them looked at the noose and murmured, "It was for the greater good." No one answered. The rope tightened, the floor opened, and for a moment, there was only silence, heavy, endless, and absolute. When it was over, the guards removed their hats. The chaplain closed his Bible. The world had taken its revenge, yet the air felt colder, as if something deeper than justice had been lost along the way. Outside, dawn finally broke over Nuremberg. The bells of a ruined church began to ring, and for the first time in years, the city was silent, not from fear, but from remembrance. The ropes had fallen silent, but the questions remained. Nuremberg had delivered its verdicts, yet no sentence could erase what had been done. The files were closed, the photographs archived, the witnesses dismissed. But history does not end with signatures. It lingers in the silence between them. Across Europe, survivors returned to empty homes. Some rebuilt, others could not. The world began to speak the word justice again, though few truly understood what it meant anymore. For those who had lived through the darkness, justice was not a verdict. It was the ability to sleep without hearing screams. Years passed, nations rebuilt. Cities were reborn from rubble, adorned with flags of peace. The doctors' names faded from newspapers, replaced by new leaders, new wars, new discoveries. But every hospital, every classroom, every scientific oath now carried a shadow. A warning carved into the collective conscience. First, do no harm. A phrase that had once been mere tradition now sounded like a prayer whispered to the dead. In Germany, young students studied the trial transcripts. Some could not believe what their countrymen had done. Others refused to read them at all. In America, professors cited the Nuremberg Code, a new law of ethics, born from blood and regret. For the first time in human history, medicine was forced to ask itself, where does knowledge end and morality begin? But not everyone accepted the weight of that question. Some of the convicted had escaped justice. Others, untouched, returned to quiet lives, their crimes buried beneath bureaucratic dust. Governments that once demanded truth began to prefer silence. Progress required forgetting, and the Cold War demanded new alliances. Old scientists were suddenly useful again. And so the world moved forward, walking carefully over its own scars. A few refused to forget. Survivors wrote their memories in trembling hands. Judges gave lectures until their voices failed. A handful of investigators kept the files alive, convinced that remembrance was the only antidote to repetition. One of them wrote, "We judged them, but we also judged ourselves." Because Nuremberg was never just about 11 men in a courtroom. It was about the fragile thread that holds morality together when obedience becomes convenient. In the decades that followed, the name Nuremberg became both warning and hope. It reminded humanity that knowledge without compassion leads to ruin, and that the mind, no matter how brilliant, is nothing without a soul. And yet, somewhere beneath that lesson, another truth whispered. A quieter one. That evil rarely ends. It merely waits for a new laboratory, a new leader, a new justification. The city of Nuremberg rebuilt its walls. Flowers grew over the ruins. Tourists walked past the courthouse, unaware that beneath their feet, the ghosts of the condemned still listened. Because history never truly buries its dead. It only asks that we remember why they fell. The courtroom is gone now. The benches are empty. The echoes of boots and verdicts have long faded into dust. But judgment never truly ends. It only changes form. For justice written by men is limited by time. It weighs evidence, hears witnesses, measures guilt. Yet beyond the reach of law lies another tribunal, one that no nation can assemble and no power can silence. The tribunal of conscience. Every man who stood in that dock faced more than the rope. He faced the moment when silence broke inside him, when the memory of what he had done refused to fade. Some found religion in the shadow of the gallows. Others died unrepentant, believing history could not touch them. But history has its own eternity, and it never forgets. In the years that followed, the doctors' names disappeared from books and walls. Their faces blurred in photographs, but their deeds remained as warnings, as questions, as mirrors. Because Nuremberg was not only their judgment, it was ours. It asked humanity a question that still echoes. when science, obedience, and ambition unite without conscience? Who will speak for the soul? Perhaps that is the true legacy of Nuremberg. Not the rope, not the verdict, but the realization that evil does not vanish when punished. It vanishes only when remembered. The snow falls quietly over the old courthouse. The wind passes through the broken stones, whispering to the ghosts of the condemned and the innocent alike. And somewhere in that silence, a voice still lingers. Soft, eternal, unanswerable. The world judged them. But who will judge the world? Before you leave, take a moment to remember that stories like this must never be forgotten. If this film moved you, if it made you reflect on what humanity can become, both in darkness and in light, then subscribe to this channel. Here, history is not just retold, it is felt. Every story is a reminder, every voice a warning, every silence a lesson. Join us, and let's keep the memory alive together.